Humans have invented thousands of ways to die. Refusing to pay the bill turned out to be one of the worst. Fact 1. A disagreement over a taxi fare in London became a fatal lesson in how quickly a small amount of money can turn into a life-or-death confrontation. In the early hours after a night out, a passenger refused to pay his fare, insisting the driver was overcharging him. What should have ended with an argument or a call to police instead spiraled into violence. Witnesses later described a heated exchange that grew more aggressive with every passing second. Neither side wanted to back down. Pride became more important than common sense. The passenger attempted to leave without paying. The confrontation escalated, and a physical struggle followed. By the time emergency services arrived, the situation had gone far beyond a simple dispute over transportation cost. It's astonishing how often major tragedies begin with people fighting over surprisingly small amounts of money. In the end, the fare was insignificant. The consequences were not. Fact 2. In Florida, a restaurant bill became the spark for a deadly chain of events that no one in the dining room could have predicted when the meal began. A customer finished eating, received the check, and immediately objected to the charges. Staff members explained the bill, but the customer insisted he wasn't paying for certain items. Voices rose. Other diners started watching. What began as an ordinary customer complaint transformed into a public confrontation fueled by embarrassment and anger. Employees attempted to prevent the man from leaving without paying. Instead of calming down, he became increasingly hostile. Witnesses later recalled that the argument seemed completely out of proportion to the amount involved. Yet, that is often the pattern in these cases. Once pride enters the equation, the original issue almost disappears. During the confrontation, violence erupted, leaving one person dead and several others traumatized. A dinner bill worth less than a tank of gas ultimately became the starting point of a tragedy nobody would forget. Fact 3. One of the most chilling examples involved a dispute over payment for work already completed. A contractor spent days finishing a project for a homeowner who repeatedly delayed payment. At first, the excuses sounded temporary. The check was coming, the bank was closed, there was a misunderstanding. Eventually, the contractor demanded what he was owed. The homeowner responded with anger rather than payment. Neighbors later described growing tension between the two men as arguments became more frequent. What made the case especially tragic was how preventable it was. The amount owed was significant but hardly life-changing. Yet both sides became locked in a battle of principle. When they met again to discuss the debt, emotions boiled over. The confrontation turned violent, ending with a fatal outcome that shocked the entire community. The money that started the dispute was eventually spent on legal fees, investigations, and court proceedings. The payment was never the real issue. Ego became the most expensive debt of all. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. We're curious to see how far our videos travel around the world. Fact 4. A parking fee at a small apartment complex in Texas triggered a confrontation that ended far beyond anything the people involved could have imagined. A resident had accumulated several unpaid parking charges and received repeated warnings from management. When a towing company arrived to remove the vehicle, the owner rushed outside and demanded the truck operator release it immediately. The driver explained that the vehicle could only be returned after the outstanding fees were paid. That answer only fueled the residents' anger. Witnesses described shouting that echoed across the parking lot as neighbors stepped outside to watch. What began as a dispute over a few $100s quickly became intensely personal. The resident viewed the tow as theft. The driver viewed the refusal to pay as deliberate disrespect. Within minutes, the argument escalated into violence. A routine enforcement action over parking fees ended with a death, leaving an entire neighborhood stunned. Fact 5. In California, a disagreement over a nightclub tab became a textbook example of how quickly alcohol, pride, and money can become a dangerous combination. A group of friends spent hours celebrating, ordering drinks throughout the night. Everything seemed normal until the final bill arrived. One man insisted several charges were inaccurate and flatly refused to pay his portion. Staff attempted to resolve the issue calmly, reviewing receipts and explaining the charges. Instead of settling the matter, the discussion grew louder and more hostile. Security personnel eventually became involved, hoping to escort the group outside before things worsened. Unfortunately, the argument followed them into the parking lot. Witnesses later recalled that nobody seemed willing to walk away. Every attempt at de-escalation was met with more insults and accusations. The confrontation spiraled into violence, resulting in a fatal outcome. What started as a disagreement over drinks became a tragedy that overshadowed an entire night of celebration. Fact 6. A debt collection dispute in New York proved that some of the deadliest conflicts begin with money people believe they should never have to pay. A middle-aged man had borrowed funds from an acquaintance years earlier and repeatedly promised repayment. At first, the lender was patient. Months turned into years and patience slowly disappeared. Eventually, the lender confronted him face-to-face and demanded the money. Friends later said the borrower felt humiliated by the public pressure and insisted he owed nothing. The argument became a long-running feud, with both men growing increasingly bitter. When they met again to discuss the debt, neither intended to compromise. Witnesses described a conversation that immediately turned hostile, reopening years of resentment. The dispute quickly escalated into violence, ending with a death that shocked everyone who knew them. Looking back, investigators noted that the original debt was substantial but not extraordinary. The real damage came from wounded pride accumulating interest for years. Fact 7. A taxi ride in Philadelphia became the final trip for one passenger after a dispute over a relatively small fare spiraled completely out of control. The passenger believed the driver had taken a longer route intentionally and refused to pay the full amount shown on the meter. The driver insisted the route was necessary because of traffic conditions. What should have been a simple disagreement became a heated argument in the middle of a busy street. Pedestrians stopped to watch as both men exchanged accusations. Neither wanted to appear weak in front of the growing crowd. The argument continued long after the ride had ended, transforming from a discussion about money into a battle of ego. Witnesses later said the actual fare became irrelevant within minutes. The confrontation eventually turned violent, leading to a fatal outcome that stunned the neighborhood. A payment that barely covered a restaurant meal ultimately carried a devastating human cost. Fact 8. One of the most tragic cases involved a contractor and a homeowner locked in a bitter dispute over renovation costs. The project had started normally. The homeowner requested additional work throughout construction, and the contractor completed it expecting to be compensated. When the final invoice arrived, the homeowner refused to pay the full amount, arguing that certain improvements were not worth the price. Weeks of arguments followed. Emails became threats. Phone calls became shouting matches. Friends urged both men to involve lawyers and avoid meeting in person. Neither listened. Convinced he had been cheated, the contractor arrived at the property demanding immediate payment. The homeowner refused again. Witnesses later described years of frustration pouring into a single explosive confrontation. What began as a disagreement over a home improvement bill escalated into deadly violence. The house itself remained standing, but the lives connected to it were permanently destroyed by a debt neither side would let go. Fact 9. A dispute over a towing bill in Georgia became a grim reminder that some people would rather risk everything than admit they owe money. After a vehicle was impounded following multiple parking violations, the owner arrived at the lot furious about the fees required for its release. Employees explained that the charges were standard and legally authorized, but the man insisted he was being robbed. Security footage later showed him pacing the lot, arguing with workers, and refusing every attempt to calm the situation. What made the case particularly tragic was how ordinary it seemed at first. Every day, tow yards deal with angry customers. Most complain, pay, and leave. This time was different. The confrontation escalated as frustration turned into rage. Within minutes, a disagreement over a bill worth only a few $100s became a violent incident that left one person dead. The vehicle was eventually released, but the cost of that argument became immeasurable. Fact 10. In Detroit, a long-running feud over unpaid rent ended in a way neither side could ever reverse. A tenant had fallen behind on payments for months, offering excuse after excuse while the property owner struggled to recover the money. Court notices were issued, deadlines passed, and eviction proceedings began. Friends described both men as stubborn, convinced they were completely right. When the landlord arrived to discuss the situation one final time, emotions were already running high. The tenant believed he was being unfairly pressured. The landlord believed he was being deliberately exploited. What should have been a legal matter transformed into a deeply personal conflict, fueled by resentment accumulated over many months. Witnesses later recalled hearing shouting before the confrontation turned violent. By the time police arrived, a simple rent dispute had become a homicide investigation. The unpaid rent that sparked the conflict amounted to only a fraction of what the tragedy would ultimately cost everyone involved. Fact 11. A mechanic in Ohio spent weeks repairing a customer's vehicle only to discover that collecting payment would become far more difficult than fixing the car itself. The customer repeatedly delayed pickup, complained about the invoice, and insisted certain repairs had never been authorized. Shop employees produced paperwork showing otherwise, but the disagreement only intensified. The mechanic had invested significant time and labor into the project and felt he was being cheated. The customer felt he was being overcharged. Neither side trusted the other. When the vehicle owner finally arrived at the garage, witnesses immediately sensed tension. The discussion quickly shifted from repair costs to accusations of dishonesty and greed. What started as a disagreement over an automotive bill escalated into a confrontation no one expected to become deadly. Investigators later noted that the amount in dispute was relatively modest compared to the devastating consequences. A vehicle that had entered the shop needing repairs ultimately became connected to a tragedy no wrench could ever fix. Fact 12. A gambling debt in Las Vegas created one of the most predictable yet heartbreaking examples of how unpaid money can destroy lives. Two longtime acquaintances had spent years frequenting the same casinos, occasionally lending money to one another during losing streaks. Eventually, one loan grew far larger than expected. The borrower promised repayment after every big win that never arrived. Months turned into years. The lender grew increasingly frustrated, believing his generosity had been taken advantage of. Friends attempted to mediate, urging both men to settle the matter peacefully. Instead, every conversation reopened old grievances. When they finally met to discuss the debt face-to-face, the meeting quickly deteriorated into accusations and threats. Witnesses described decades of friendship unraveling in a single afternoon. The confrontation eventually became violent, ending in death. Ironically, the amount that triggered the dispute was insignificant compared to what both men had already lost. The debt was financial, but the real bankruptcy was emotional. Fact 13. Perhaps one of the most shocking cases began with something as ordinary as a utility bill. In a small American town, a contractor responsible for maintaining service equipment arrived at a property after repeated notices regarding unpaid charges. The homeowner had ignored months of warnings and believed the company had no right to disconnect service. Neighbors later recalled seeing arguments between the homeowner and utility representatives long before the final encounter. By the day crews arrived, frustration had been building for nearly a year. Workers attempted to explain the situation calmly, emphasizing that the action was required under company policy. The homeowner saw it as a personal attack and refused to cooperate. What followed shocked the entire community. A confrontation that started over overdue payments escalated into deadly violence, transforming a routine service call into national news. The unpaid bill itself was forgettable. The consequences became a permanent part of the town's history. Fact 14. A dispute over a storage unit bill in California revealed how quickly financial pressure can turn ordinary people into enemies. A customer had rented a storage space for years but gradually fell behind on payments. Notices piled up, deadlines expired, and the facility eventually prepared to auction the contents according to state law. The renter was convinced the company was acting unfairly and believed more time should have been granted. Employees explained that multiple warnings had already been issued, but frustration had long since replaced reason. When the customer arrived and learned the property was about to be sold, an intense argument erupted in front of staff and other renters. Witnesses later described a scene fueled by panic, embarrassment, and anger. What began as a dispute over overdue fees escalated rapidly into violence. By the end of the confrontation, a death had occurred. Years of possessions were lost, but they were overshadowed by a far greater and irreversible loss. Fact 15. In Pennsylvania, a disagreement over a car sale became a tragic example of how unpaid money can poison relationships. Two men had agreed on the sale of a used vehicle through a private arrangement. The buyer took possession of the car but repeatedly delayed making the final payment. At first, the seller believed the issue would resolve itself. Weeks turned into months, and every conversation became more hostile. Friends described the dispute as a constant source of tension, with both men convinced they were being cheated. Eventually, they arranged a meeting to settle the matter once and for all. Instead of reaching an agreement, old grievances resurfaced immediately. Witnesses later said the argument seemed less about the remaining balance and more about pride. Neither side wanted to back down. The confrontation escalated beyond words and ended in deadly violence. What began as a transaction involving a used car ultimately destroyed far more than either man ever imagined. Fact 16. A conflict over unpaid wages in the American South became one of the clearest examples of how workplace disputes can spiral into tragedy. A laborer had completed weeks of physically demanding work and expected payment on the agreed date. When payday arrived, the employer claimed financial difficulties and asked for more time. The worker accepted the explanation initially, but repeated delays followed. Family members later recalled how frustration grew with every broken promise. The laborer believed he was being exploited. The employer insisted he intended to pay eventually. After months of tension, the worker arrived, demanding the money he had earned. Witnesses described a heated argument that immediately turned personal. Years of financial stress and resentment surfaced in a matter of minutes. The dispute escalated into violence, ending with a fatal outcome that devastated both families. The unpaid wages were significant, but the emotional cost of the confrontation proved far greater than any paycheck. Fact 17. A neighborhood gambling game in Louisiana ended in disaster after a winner made a simple request: pay what you owe. The card game had started as a friendly gathering among acquaintances who had played together for years. As the night progressed, one participant accumulated substantial losses and continued borrowing money from others at the table. By the end of the evening, he owed a considerable amount and promised to settle the debt the following day. The promise was never fulfilled. Days later, the winner confronted him about repayment. What should have been a routine discussion quickly became emotional. Witnesses recalled accusations of cheating, dishonesty, and betrayal flying back and forth. The debt itself became secondary as both men focused on defending their pride. When tempers reached a breaking point, the confrontation turned violent. A game intended for entertainment ended with a death, proving once again that money has a remarkable ability to transform friends into enemies. Fact 18. Perhaps one of the most astonishing cases began with something most Americans encounter every year: a tax bill. A property owner had accumulated years of unpaid taxes and repeatedly ignored notices from local authorities. Eventually, officials moved forward with legal proceedings that could result in the loss of the property. The homeowner viewed every attempt at collection as harassment and became increasingly hostile toward anyone connected to the process. Court records later showed multiple warnings, opportunities to appeal, and chances to resolve the debt peacefully. None succeeded. When officials arrived regarding the ongoing enforcement action, emotions that had been building for years finally exploded. Witnesses described a confrontation fueled by fear, anger, and desperation. What started as unpaid taxes evolved into a deadly incident that shocked the region and generated national headlines. The amount originally owed was substantial, but compared to the lives forever changed by the tragedy, the debt itself seemed almost insignificant. Fact 19. A dispute over child support payments in the Midwest became a tragic example of how financial obligations can fuel years of resentment. Court records showed a long history of missed payments, legal notices, and failed attempts to resolve the issue peacefully. The parent owed substantial back support and repeatedly argued that the amount was unfair. Meanwhile, the other parent viewed every missed payment as another broken promise. Over time, what started as a financial disagreement evolved into a deeply personal conflict involving family members, attorneys, and court officials. When the two finally met to discuss the growing debt, emotions that had been building for years surfaced all at once. Witnesses later described a conversation that quickly turned hostile. Old accusations replaced any hope of compromise. The confrontation escalated into violence, resulting in a death that devastated multiple families. The unpaid support had already damaged relationships, but the final outcome left scars that would last generations. Fact 20. A dispute over a boat purchase along the Gulf Coast proved that even recreational luxuries can become the center of deadly conflicts. A buyer agreed to purchase a used fishing boat and made an initial payment, promising the remainder later. As weeks passed, excuses replaced money. The seller became increasingly frustrated, believing he had been deceived. The buyer insisted the vessel had mechanical issues that justified withholding payment. What followed was a months-long argument involving phone calls, threats, and failed negotiations. Friends urged both men to settle the disagreement through lawyers, but neither wanted the expense or delay. Eventually, they arranged a meeting at a marina to resolve the matter directly. Witnesses later recalled tension from the moment they arrived. The discussion quickly deteriorated into accusations and anger. Before long, the confrontation became violent, ending with a fatal outcome. A boat intended for peaceful days on the water ultimately became connected to a tragedy neither family would ever forget. Fact 21. In a small southern town, a dispute over funeral expenses created one of the most heartbreaking stories in this category. Following the death of a family member, relatives disagreed over who should pay the costs associated with the service and burial. What began as a private disagreement soon expanded into a bitter feud involving siblings, cousins, and longtime grudges. Family members accused one another of avoiding responsibility while still demanding control over funeral decisions. As bills arrived, tensions intensified. During a meeting intended to settle the matter, years of unresolved resentment suddenly resurfaced. Witnesses later described arguments that had little to do with money and everything to do with old wounds. The funeral expenses simply provided the spark. The confrontation escalated beyond words and ended in deadly violence. In a cruel twist, a gathering meant to honor one life lost resulted in another death. The family left with grief multiplied rather than shared. Fact 22. A construction project in Arizona turned deadly after a disagreement over subcontractor payments. A crew had completed a major portion of work on a commercial property and expected payment according to the contract. When deadlines passed without compensation, frustration spread quickly among workers who depended on the money. The contractor blamed cash flow problems and promised payment would arrive soon. Those promises continued for months. Employees later described growing anger as unpaid bills accumulated at home. Eventually, representatives from the crew met with the contractor to demand answers. Witnesses recalled that the discussion began professionally but deteriorated almost immediately. Accusations of fraud and dishonesty filled the room. What made the situation particularly tragic was that legal options were available to everyone involved. Instead, emotions took control. The confrontation escalated into violence and resulted in a fatal outcome. The money eventually became part of court proceedings, but the life lost could never be recovered. Fact 23. A dispute involving an antique collection became national news after years of financial disagreement exploded into tragedy. An elderly collector had loaned valuable historical items to an acquaintance under an arrangement that included future payment. Over time, disagreements emerged regarding the value of the collection and the amount still owed. Each side accused the other of acting in bad faith. What started as a business arrangement gradually transformed into a personal feud. Friends said both men became obsessed with proving they were right. Every conversation ended in anger. Every attempt at mediation failed. Eventually, they agreed to meet one final time and settle the matter. Instead, the discussion reopened years of frustration and mistrust. Witnesses later described a confrontation that escalated with shocking speed. By the end of the encounter, one person was dead. The antique collection remained intact, but the obsession over ownership and payment destroyed far more valuable things. Fact 24. Perhaps one of the most astonishing cases involved a lottery syndicate made up of friends who had played together for years. The arrangement was simple. Everyone contributed money, and any winnings would be shared equally. One week, a participant failed to contribute but still expected a share if the group won. When the ticket later produced a significant prize, arguments erupted over who deserved the money. What should have been a joyful celebration became a bitter conflict, fueled by greed, disappointment, and betrayal. Members of the group stopped speaking to one another. Lawyers became involved. Friendships that had lasted decades collapsed almost overnight. During a heated confrontation about the winnings and unpaid contribution, emotions reached a breaking point. Witnesses described years of trust unraveling in a matter of minutes. The dispute escalated into deadly violence, transforming what should have been a life-changing stroke of luck into a tragedy remembered for entirely different reasons. Fact 25. A dispute over unpaid inheritance money in rural Tennessee became a tragedy years in the making. After the death of a family patriarch, relatives expected the estate to be divided according to his wishes. Instead, disagreements emerged almost immediately regarding property values, bank accounts, and who was entitled to what. One family member became convinced that money had been intentionally withheld and demanded compensation. Lawyers were hired, accusations flew, and holiday gatherings disappeared entirely. What made the situation especially heartbreaking was that the family had once been extremely close. By the time everyone met to discuss a final settlement, trust had completely evaporated. Witnesses later described a conversation dominated by old resentments rather than financial facts. The inheritance had become a symbol of decades of unresolved family conflict. When emotions boiled over, the confrontation escalated into deadly violence. The estate was eventually distributed, but the family itself never recovered from what happened. Fact 26. In Chicago, a disagreement over a winning sports bet turned deadly after one man refused to honor a wager he had enthusiastically accepted weeks earlier. The bet centered on a major championship game, and throughout the season, both participants joked about the outcome. Everything seemed harmless until the final result became official. The losing bettor suddenly claimed the wager had never been serious and refused to pay. What followed was months of arguments, public embarrassment, and escalating hostility. Friends attempted to mediate, reminding both men that the amount involved was relatively modest. Unfortunately, the issue had long since stopped being about money. Pride became the real currency. Every discussion turned into a contest over respect and reputation. During a final confrontation about the unpaid bet, tempers exploded. The disagreement escalated into violence and resulted in a death. A game designed to entertain millions ended up destroying lives far beyond the stadium. Fact 27. A dispute involving unpaid livestock in Texas demonstrated how financial conflicts can become deeply personal in agricultural communities. A rancher sold several head of cattle to a longtime acquaintance under an agreement that payment would be delivered after resale. Months passed without compensation. At first, the seller remained patient, believing the delay was temporary. Eventually, repeated excuses replaced any confidence he had left. Neighbors later recalled growing tension between the two men as every encounter became more hostile. The cattle themselves were no longer the central issue. The seller felt betrayed by someone he had trusted for years. When they finally met to settle the debt, the discussion quickly turned emotional. Witnesses described accusations of dishonesty, greed, and broken promises filling the air. What should have been a straightforward business matter spiraled into violence. By the end of the confrontation, one person was dead. The unpaid livestock became a footnote in a far larger tragedy. Fact 28. A disagreement over a private loan between close friends in Florida became a devastating lesson about mixing friendship and money. One man had loaned a substantial amount to help his friend through financial difficulties, trusting that repayment would eventually come. Years passed, payments remained inconsistent, and communication deteriorated. The lender grew increasingly frustrated as he watched his friend make expensive purchases while claiming poverty. The borrower insisted circumstances prevented full repayment and accused his friend of harassment. What began as generosity slowly transformed into bitterness. Mutual friends found themselves forced to choose sides. Eventually, the two arranged a meeting intended to settle the matter permanently. Witnesses later said the atmosphere was tense from the start. Neither man arrived prepared to compromise. Old grievances resurfaced immediately, and the conversation rapidly deteriorated. The confrontation escalated into deadly violence, ending a friendship that had survived decades but could not survive an unpaid debt. Fact 29. One of the most shocking cases involved a dispute over a relatively small bill at a convenience store. A customer entered the store late at night, selected several items, and approached the counter. When the total appeared, he argued that certain products were incorrectly priced and refused to pay the amount requested. Employees attempted to explain the pricing, but the disagreement intensified. Surveillance footage later showed a growing crowd of customers watching the confrontation unfold. What made the incident remarkable was how ordinary it appeared during the first few minutes. Similar arguments happen every day across America. This one took a different path. As tempers rose, insults replaced discussion, and emotions overtook reason. The situation escalated beyond anyone's expectations, eventually resulting in deadly violence. Investigators later noted that the disputed amount was less than many people spend on lunch. Yet that small sum became the spark for consequences, measured not in dollars, but in lives. Fact 30. A dispute over unpaid scrap metal turned deadly in a case that stunned a small industrial community. Two men had worked together for years collecting, transporting, and selling scrap materials. The arrangement was informal, built more on trust than paperwork. After a particularly profitable sale, one partner claimed he never received his fair share of the proceeds. At first, the disagreement seemed manageable. They argued, stopped speaking, and continued their separate lives. But resentment has a way of growing when money remains unresolved. Months later, mutual acquaintances reported that both men remained obsessed with the dispute. Every conversation somehow returned to the missing payment. Eventually, they met to settle the matter directly. Witnesses later described a discussion that quickly shifted from finances to personal insults. The confrontation escalated into violence, ending in death. Ironically, the value of the disputed scrap metal was insignificant compared to the destruction caused by the arguments surrounding it. Fact 31. In Nevada, a disagreement over casino winnings became a cautionary tale about greed and suspicion. A group of friends pooled money to play together during a weekend trip. The arrangement was simple. Everyone contributed equally, and any winnings would be divided among the group. Late one evening, one member hit a substantial jackpot. Almost immediately, questions emerged about who had contributed, who was present, and who deserved a share. What should have been a celebration transformed into a bitter dispute. Friends who had known one another for decades suddenly viewed each other as adversaries. Witnesses later described heated arguments spreading from the casino floor into parking lots, restaurants, and private gatherings. The jackpot itself became less important than proving who was right. Eventually, a confrontation turned violent and resulted in a death. The money that promised a better future instead destroyed relationships and left a permanent scar on everyone involved. Fact 32. A conflict over unpaid farm equipment in the Midwest demonstrated how financial disputes can devastate entire communities. A farmer sold expensive machinery to a neighboring landowner under an agreement that payment would be completed after harvest season. When the harvest ended, the promised money never arrived. The buyer claimed unexpected losses had made repayment impossible. The seller insisted an agreement was an agreement. What followed was a months-long feud that divided neighbors who had known each other for generations. Local residents watched as every conversation between the two men became increasingly hostile. Community events became uncomfortable because both parties were usually present. Eventually, the seller demanded immediate payment during a face-to-face meeting. Witnesses later said neither man appeared willing to compromise. The argument escalated rapidly, ending in deadly violence. The equipment remained exactly where it had always been, but the lives surrounding it were changed forever. Fact 33. Perhaps one of the most astonishing cases involved a disagreement over a relatively small debt between family members that spiraled into national headlines. The conflict began when a man loaned money to a relative facing financial hardship. Initially, the arrangement seemed straightforward. Repayment would occur once the borrower regained stability. Instead, months became years. Family gatherings grew tense. Conversations that once centered on holidays and children became dominated by arguments about money. Relatives attempted to mediate, urging both sides to let the matter go before it consumed the entire family. Neither listened. The lender felt betrayed by broken promises. The borrower felt humiliated by constant reminders of the debt. Eventually, years of frustration exploded during a confrontation witnessed by multiple family members. What started as a simple loan became a deadly encounter that shattered relationships across an entire extended family. The money was eventually forgotten. The tragedy never was. Which one was the dumbest reason to die, and would you have walked away?